When love turns toxic, it rarely begins with warning signs. It begins with intensity that feels like destiny. In the early stages, everything feels perfect. Attention is constant, emotions are heightened, and connection feels unbreakable. Psychologically, this phase activates deep emotional bonding, making the brain associate the person with safety and excitement. You ignore small inconsistencies because the emotional highs feel overwhelming. This stage creates a powerful illusion that this connection is rare and meant to last. But beneath this intensity, patterns of dependency begin forming silently. You start emotionally investing faster than you can evaluate reality. The mind becomes attached not to who the person truly is, but to how they make you feel in those peak moments. This emotional foundation becomes the reason why leaving later feels impossible, even when pain begins to replace love. As time passes, love begins to change its shape, often without clear warning. What once felt like care slowly starts turning into control. Psychologically, this shift is subtle, making it difficult to identify at first. Questions become monitoring, concern becomes restriction, and attention becomes emotional surveillance. You may start adjusting your behavior to avoid conflict or emotional withdrawal from the other person. This is where imbalance begins to grow. One person starts defining boundaries, while the other starts losing them. Love no longer feels free. It starts feeling conditional. You begin to notice that your actions are being evaluated, your choices questioned, and your independence slowly reduced. Yet you stay, because the memory of how it once felt still holds emotional power. This transition marks the beginning of toxic attachment, where affection and control begin to merge. When love turns toxic, emotional dependency develops quietly in the background. You begin to rely on the other person for emotional stability, validation, and even self-worth. Psychologically, this creates a pattern where your internal emotional state becomes dependent on external reactions. A message brings relief, silence brings anxiety, attention brings happiness, and distance brings fear. Over time, this dependency weakens your ability to regulate your own emotions. You start waiting for reassurance instead of trusting your own thoughts. The relationship becomes less about connection and more about emotional survival. Even when you feel hurt, the idea of separation feels more painful than staying. This dependency traps you in a cycle where you need the same person who is causing emotional instability. And slowly, your sense of self becomes tied to their presence, making detachment feel like losing part of your identity. One of the most dangerous aspects of toxic love is how pain begins to feel normal. Psychologically, repeated emotional distress lowers your sensitivity to unhealthy behavior. What once felt unacceptable starts becoming tolerable. You begin to justify actions that hurt you, convincing yourself that every relationship has flaws. Small apologies reset emotional damage temporarily, but the pattern remains unchanged. Over time, your expectations decrease, and your emotional boundaries weaken. You stop questioning behavior that should have been addressed early. This normalization creates a distorted perception of love, where inconsistency and emotional neglect are seen as part of passion. The mind adapts to survive the emotional environment, even if it is unhealthy. And in this adaptation, you slowly lose awareness of what healthy love actually feels like, making it harder to recognize when things have truly gone wrong. When love turns toxic, relationships often shift into silent power struggles. Psychologically, this happens when emotional balance is replaced by control dynamics. One person begins to hold more emotional influence, deciding when attention is given, when affection is shown, and when distance is created. The other person begins to react rather than act, constantly trying to restore balance. This creates emotional tension where love becomes uncertain and unpredictable. You may find yourself overanalyzing behavior, trying to regain emotional security. Conversations become strategic rather than natural, and emotional expression becomes cautious. Instead of mutual understanding, the relationship turns into emotional negotiation. Each person tries to protect their position within the connection. This struggle does not always appear openly, but it deeply affects emotional stability. And in this silent battle, love slowly transforms into control, fear, and emotional exhaustion rather than connection. When love turns toxic, the emotional experience becomes addictive rather than peaceful. Psychologically, the brain begins to crave the intense highs that come after periods of emotional distance or conflict. These moments of affection feel unusually powerful because they break the pattern of tension. This creates a reinforcement cycle where pain increases the value of relief. You start waiting for the good version of the person, holding on to brief moments of warmth as proof that love still exists. The unpredictability strengthens attachment, because the mind becomes focused on earning emotional reward again. Instead of stability, you begin to chase intensity. Calm moments feel boring, while emotional chaos feels meaningful. This shift is dangerous because it redefines love as something you must constantly struggle to maintain. Over time, the addiction to emotional highs keeps you trapped, even when the overall experience becomes deeply draining and inconsistent. In toxic love, psychological manipulation often enters subtly through reality distortion. Gaslighting is one of the most damaging forms of this, where your perception of events is questioned or invalidated. Psychologically, this creates confusion between what you experience and what you are told happened. You begin to doubt your memory, your emotions, and even your judgment. Over time, this weakens your confidence in your own perception. You may start relying on the other person to define what is real. This creates emotional dependency and loss of self-trust. The mind becomes uncertain, constantly second-guessing itself. Even clear emotional pain becomes difficult to express, because you fear being misunderstood or dismissed. This distortion slowly shifts control away from you and places it in the hands of the other person. And when your reality is no longer stable, your emotional independence begins to collapse. As toxic love deepens, your sense of identity begins to fade. Psychologically, this happens when your emotional focus shifts entirely toward maintaining the relationship. You start adjusting your behavior, opinions, and even personality traits to avoid conflict or rejection. Over time, you lose clarity about who you are outside the relationship. Your decisions become influenced by how the other person might react rather than what you truly feel. This creates a gradual erosion of individuality. You may stop pursuing personal interests, avoid expressing disagreement, or suppress emotional needs. The relationship slowly becomes your entire emotional world. When identity becomes dependent on another person, separation feels like losing yourself. This is why toxic love becomes so difficult to leave, because it is no longer just about attachment. It is about losing the version of yourself that existed within that connection. Toxic love does not always appear as constant conflict. Sometimes it appears as emotional absence. Psychological neglect occurs when emotional needs are consistently unmet or ignored. This can be more damaging than direct conflict because it is harder to identify. You may still have conversations, share time and presence, but without emotional depth or understanding. Over time, you begin to feel unseen even while being physically connected. This creates emotional isolation within the relationship. You may try harder to communicate, express feelings, or seek closeness, but without response, the effort becomes exhausting. Eventually, you start minimizing your own needs to avoid disappointment. Emotional neglect teaches you to expect less, to feel less, and to ask for less. And in doing so, it slowly weakens your emotional expression, making you settle for connection that lacks true emotional presence. Even in toxic love, there comes a moment when awareness begins to rise. Psychologically, this is when emotional pain starts to outweigh emotional attachment. You begin to notice patterns instead of isolated incidents. The confusion starts turning into clarity, and denial begins to weaken. You realize that the cycle is repeating, not changing. This awareness is often painful because it challenges the emotional narrative you have been holding on to. You start questioning whether love should feel this draining, this uncertain, this unstable. The breaking point is not always a dramatic event. It can be a quiet realization that something fundamental feels wrong. This moment marks the beginning of emotional awakening. You may not leave immediately, but something within you shifts. You begin to see the relationship not as destiny, but as a pattern. And once awareness enters, the illusion of toxic love starts to lose its power. When love turns toxic, an internal war begins between emotion and logic. Psychologically, the heart holds on to emotional memories, while the mind begins recognizing patterns of harm. This creates constant inner conflict. One part of you remembers affection, laughter, and connection, while another part notices inconsistency, neglect, and emotional pain. You oscillate between staying and leaving, unable to fully commit to either decision. This mental division drains emotional energy because there is no resolution. The heart seeks attachment, while the mind seeks protection. In toxic love, emotions often overpower logic. especially when memories of affection are strong. This is why leaving feels impossible, even when awareness is present. You are not just fighting the relationship, you are fighting yourself. And this internal conflict becomes one of the most exhausting parts of toxic attachment, keeping you stuck in emotional uncertainty. Toxic relationships survive on a powerful psychological loop. Hope followed by disappointment. Each moment of connection creates belief that things will improve. You start thinking that change is possible, that understanding will grow, that love will return to its original form. But then the pattern repeats, and disappointment follows. This cycle creates emotional instability because hope resets pain temporarily. Psychologically, hope becomes a coping mechanism that keeps you emotionally invested. Even after repeated hurt, you continue believing in potential rather than reality. Each small positive moment feels like progress, even when the overall pattern remains unchanged. This cycle strengthens attachment because it keeps you emotionally engaged through expectation. Over time, you become trapped between what is and what could be, making it harder to accept what is actually happening in the present. As toxic love continues, emotional exhaustion begins to set in. Psychologically, constant emotional fluctuation drains mental energy, leaving you feeling tired even when nothing physical has happened. You may find yourself overthinking conversations, analyzing behavior, and replaying interactions repeatedly. This creates mental fatigue. Emotional burnout occurs when giving, hoping, and adjusting no longer bring relief. Instead, everything feels heavy. You start feeling disconnected from your own emotions because they are constantly activated. Even moments of peace feel temporary, as if something might go wrong again. This state of exhaustion makes it harder to think clearly or make decisions. You may withdraw socially, lose interest in daily activities, or feel emotionally numb. Toxic love does not just hurt the heart, it drains the mind, leaving you mentally overwhelmed and emotionally depleted. One of the strongest psychological traps in toxic love is attachment to potential rather than reality. You do not stay for what is happening now. You stay for what you believe could happen. You imagine the person changing, becoming more loving, more understanding, more consistent. This imagined version becomes more powerful than the actual experience. Psychologically, this is rooted in hope bias, where the mind prioritizes future possibility over present evidence. You begin to ignore patterns that do not align with this vision. The relationship becomes a project rather than a reality. You invest emotionally in transformation instead of acceptance. This creates prolonged attachment because letting go feels like abandoning something unfinished. But what you are truly holding on to is not the person. It is the idea of who they might become. Walking away from toxic love is not a simple decision. It is a psychological struggle. Even when you recognize the harm, emotional attachment resists separation. Psychologically, this is because the brain associates the person with emotional relief and familiarity. The idea of leaving triggers fear, uncertainty, and emotional discomfort. You may delay the decision, hoping things will change, or waiting for a better moment to detach. This hesitation is not weakness. It is emotional conditioning. The bond has created dependency patterns that take time to break. You may feel stuck between knowing what is right and feeling unable to act on it. This creates internal tension that prolongs suffering. Walking away requires not just understanding, but emotional courage to endure the discomfort of separation before healing can begin. When love turns toxic and separation begins, the mind experiences a withdrawal effect similar to breaking an addiction. Psychologically, the brain has become accustomed to emotional highs, validation, and intermittent connection. When that source is removed, it reacts with distress, longing, and anxiety. You may feel an intense urge to reconnect, even when you know the relationship was harmful. This is not emotional weakness. It is neurochemical dependency breaking down. Memories become more vivid. Loneliness feels heavier, and silence feels overwhelming. The mind tries to restore the familiar emotional pattern, even if it caused pain. This is why detachment feels unbearable at first. You are not only letting go of a person, but also of a chemical and emotional cycle that your brain relied on. Understanding this phase is crucial because it reveals that discomfort is part of healing, not a sign to return. After toxic love begins to unravel, self-blame often emerges. Psychologically, the mind tries to find control in painful experiences by assigning responsibility. You may start believing you tolerated too much, gave it too much, or stayed too long. While reflection is natural, toxic attachment often distorts it into guilt. You begin to question your worth, your wordjement, and your emotional strength. This internal criticism deepens emotional wounds because it shifts focus away from the unhealthy dynamics and onto yourself. You may replay moments repeatedly, wondering what you could have done differently. This creates emotional heaviness and delays healing. However, toxic love is rarely one-sided in responsibility. Recognizing patterns is important, but self-punishment is not healing. True understanding comes from awareness, not blame. You are not weak for feeling deeply. You are human in an emotionally complex bond. One of the most damaging effects of toxic love is the loss of emotional safety. Psychologically, emotional safety means feeling secure in expressing thoughts, emotions, and vulnerability without fear of rejection or punishment. In toxic relationships, this safety gradually disappears. You begin to monitor your words, hide your feelings, and avoid expressing discomfort. Over time, emotional expression becomes risky instead of natural. This creates internal tension because you are constantly adjusting yourself to avoid conflict or withdrawal. Without emotional safety, even love becomes stressful. You no longer feel relaxed in the relationship. You feel guarded. This state keeps your nervous system in alert mode, increasing anxiety and emotional fatigue. When emotional safety is lost, connection becomes survival-based rather than nurturing. And without safety, love cannot remain healthy or stable. After toxic love ends or begins to fade, rebuilding yourself becomes essential. Psychologically, this phase involves reconstructing identity, trust, and emotional balance. At first, there is emptiness, because a major emotional anchor has been removed. You may feel uncertain about your thoughts, preferences, and direction. Slowly, healing begins through reflection and separation from past patterns. You start reconnecting with parts of yourself that were suppressed during the relationship. Interests, friendships, and personal goals regain importance. Emotional clarity returns gradually, not instantly. This process requires patience because the mind is learning to function independently again. Each step of rebuilding strengthens emotional resilience. You begin to realize that your identity was never truly lost. It was just overshadowed. Recovery is not about forgetting the past, but about reclaiming yourself beyond it. The final stage of awareness is understanding what healthy love truly means after experiencing toxicity. Psychologically, healthy love is not intense chaos. It is emotional stability, mutual respect, and consistent care. It does not create confusion or fear. It creates clarity and safety. You begin to recognize that real connection does not require a constant emotional struggle. Instead, it allows space for individuality and growth. After toxic love, this understanding becomes powerful because your perception of relationships changes completely. You stop associating intensity with love and start valuing peace, consistency, and emotional security. This shift transforms how you choose future connections. You no longer chase emotional highs that lead to instability. Instead, you seek relationships that feel safe, balanced, and respectful. And in this awareness, you finally understand that real love does not consume you. It supports you. When love turns toxic, it does not end suddenly. It slowly changes shape until affection feels like confusion and connection feels like emotional exhaustion. What once brought comfort begins to create anxiety, self-doubt, and inner conflict. Psychologically, toxic love reshapes perception, making intensity feel like passion and instability feel like destiny. But with awareness comes clarity. You begin to see that real love does not demand constant emotional struggle or sacrifice of self-worth. Healing is not about forgetting the person. It is about remembering yourself. It is about rebuilding emotional safety, restoring identity, and learning that attachment should not feel like survival. The journey out is painful, but it is also liberating. You stop chasing what hurts you and start choosing what respects you. And in that shift, you discover a deeper truth. Love is not supposed to break you. It is supposed to build you, support you, and give you peace within yourself.